Thank you so much for joining. My name is Emma Hazen, and I am the Cara Development Manager with Hampton Trust. And I've also been involved in the development of DARE training. I have been involved in the development and delivery of DARE for a few years now. And I'm really keen to sort of open up this conversation further with my colleagues at the Hampton Trust around how do we bring in conversations with perpetrators into the same sort of confidence and competence that we approach any sort of work with frontline clients. And there's so much overlap in terms of the access that we've got to frontline clients in different sort of arenas. We've got a range of representation, I think, even here today in the webinar, from people working in different sectors. And so it's really about looking at our organizations and seeing where the opportunities are, where the missed opportunities are, and where we can create further opportunities. To start us off in the conversation, I wanted to really just reiterate that this is realistically a bit of a different approach to what we've seen elsewhere. So DARE, or as we call it, domestic abuse routine inquiry, born out of the same vein that we've been looking at for a long time around domestic abuse, that, we believe it's everyone's business, that we should all be bringing ourselves into that conversation and looking at what we can do to enhance that engagement. And I've certainly been involved, and I know probably a number of professionals across the country have been involved in trying to enhance that understanding and awareness of how to engage with victims of domestic abuse to ensure that we're offering the right support at the right time. And the same shift for everyone to take that responsibility needs to be taken in with the lens of looking at how to engage with perpetrators. So I'm bringing in an initial quote from our CEO, Chantel Hughes, who has highlighted that to break the cycle of domestic abuse, we need to safely identify and engage people who are causing harm in their relationships. DARE will equip you as professionals with the confidence to play your part. And that highlights the experience that we've had around DARE, which is that confidence is a big part of this. So we've been asked, and we've asked ourselves, why DARE? And it's actually come from a whole range of experiences, learning, and feedback that we've had working in the multi-agency arena. Hampton Trust have a background of working for 25 years with domestic abuse, people involved in the criminal justice system, and working with evidence-informed perpetrator programs and interventions. And this has enhanced our ability to look at what does effective engagement look like, not just with specialist services, but with everyone. We've had experiences of being embedded in social care teams, in children's centers, working alongside other professionals and trying to unpack what those barriers look like for individuals and then for the clients that they're working with. How do we encourage those conversations to get started or to carry on or to enhance further engagement? So thinking about how do we encourage that conversation, that's really where we started off the conversation of why DARE. Is we know that, well, I don't know if you've ever come across this statistic before. It feels like one of those really obvious ones, but 100% of all victims have at least one perpetrator. Now we think about the breadth of victim services that are out there, which are absolutely essential for support, for safeguarding, for ensuring that there's appropriate response and guidance and safeguarding in place, and to ensure that that experience of the victim informs an approach for addressing perpetrator behavior. But unless we're addressing that behavior with the person who's causing harm, it's going to continue to happen. And so we look at the responsibility of all frontline professionals to try and identify what are the opportunities to start that conversation. Who is it that we can start that conversation with, and at what point? And so DARE sort of unpacks what we need to understand about ourselves as professionals within the context of our own environment. It looks at what we need to understand about the people we're working with and how to explore and identify sort of the context around the people that we're working with, to try and unpack what are the opportunities to signpost them or to start a conversation to help them explore their own behavior. And then how do we have these conversations in a safe and effective way to motivate them to engage with services? And so DARE is set up to sort of follow along a pathway of learning that builds on itself to enhance this approach. We're looking at really whole system change. We're seeing nationally, there is a shift in terms of the conversation. We're looking at the development of perpetrator strategies at a national level. And what we're trying to do is encourage all professionals to take this on board. So the whole system change, what we mean by that is frontline services can embed DARE, or domestic abuse routine inquiry, as a first response to identifying and engaging with domestic abuse perpetrators. If we think about the importance of multi-agency work when it comes to domestic abuse, and also the importance of trying to identify what are the missed opportunities for perpetrator engagement. If 100% of all victims have at least one perpetrator, but 1% of perpetrators are actually offered an intervention, then we've got a real broad net that's been cast with a lot of holes in it. And so we've got a real opportunity to, even if we double the number of perpetrators we're engaging in this conversation, where we're targeting the approach to respond to the context, the risk, opportunities that are available. We're really focusing in on trying to prevent further harm by bringing perpetrators into the conversation, but obviously in a safe and effective way. So what does DARE actually do? So we have the following aims for professionals. We look at the opportunity to confidently but routinely identify domestic abuse perpetrators within your own services, people that you come across every day, potentially. What are those opportunities and how do you approach that with confidence? And then for professionals to engage with perpetrators, to bring them into a conversation, to approach that conversation with confidence, to know what to target, what are the opportunities, what are the hooks that they're bringing into the conversation that we can open up and build that rapport to explore with them further, what the benefits might be of exploring that behavior. And also to be able to confidently support perpetrators to access specialist services to be able to address their behavior in a more long-term way. We're seeing a real growth across the country around a focus of engaging with perpetrators in a safe and effective way. And while specialist services like Hampton Trust have a real targeted approach, which can be really valuable, and we've been doing this work because we believe in that opportunity to change, but there is something really important about looking at, we can only work with the people that are identified already for those specialist services. So if everybody comes into this conversation and everybody looks at the people that are coming through their services to identify them for further support, then we can really enhance the offer. And we can also take domestic abuse further out of the private sphere. The reason why we call domestic abuse is because it's in the domestic arena. And the more we avoid those conversations, the further we're reinforcing a message that this is something that is hidden. Whether we're doing that actively or we're doing that with an awareness of the impact of that, we're not bringing it into the forefront to have those open conversations about that behavior. So it's shifting the conversation, it's shifting the culture, and it's changing the whole system. DARE is delivered over 3 half-day modules, or in some cases, we may be able to cover it across 2 full-day sessions in person. But of course, being online for a full day is a heck of an ask. So for the most part, it's offered over 3 half-day modules once a week, so that there's time to process, time to reflect, time to ask questions, that sort of thing. So the first module is looking at how to identify domestic abuse perpetrators. And that's not just looking at what does a perpetrator look like, but it's also what's going on for our own processes internally within our sort of professional setting, our organization, that helps or hinders us from being able to identify perpetrators in the first instance. And then we follow that on with, once we've identified those people, what do we do to understand how to work safely with them? So we start to explore the wider context of what's going on for that person. Because targeting a conversation to engage with them, we need to understand what's going on for them first and how to target those conversations further. So module 2 is all about exploring risk and context associated with domestic abuse perpetrators. So first we start off with our own professional barriers, and then we look at perpetrator barriers for engagement. So what's preventing that from happening? What's going on for them? And then we summarize the DARE learning by focusing on the actual engagement skills and tools. So we're looking at motivational interviewing. We're looking at unpacking what they're saying and how to roll with that resistance, or how to reinforce the positives of them reflecting on their own behavior, nudging them into those specialist services through using motivational interviewing skills and tools. And we do a bit of skills practice along the way as well. So that's the DARE module overview. So I wanted to move into just briefly what some of the content might look like. So firstly, what prevents us from seeing the full picture? So I'm going to hand it over to you to see if I can't ask you to join in for a little bit. I wanted to ask, what do you think might be a belief that prevents us as professionals from being able to see fully what's going on for somebody? What is a personal belief that we have as professionals going into either working with domestic abuse or working elsewhere? What might make it difficult to identify and engage with perpetrators? What do you think?
It's trying to get the opportunity to ask the victim when the perpetrator is not there, and yeah, in order, like, ensuring that you keep them safe.
And I suppose equally thinking about how to have that conversation, knowing that maybe an alternative motivation for the perpetrator wanting to engage in a conversation with yourself as well. So maybe not knowing the safest approach in terms of having that conversation, which can lead to maybe influencing the opportunities that you've got or you're creating in your own environment at work.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think my role is a health visitor, so not going into a house and assuming that everything's okay because they say it's okay, or everybody's in, it can happen to anybody. And just making sure that you are asking everybody. But yeah, I suppose we haven't worked much. Have worked with perpetrators, but not in terms of doing any work there.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it's going in with an assumption that you can't trust everything, or an assumption that what people say should be believed right off the bat. I mean, those are both different assumptions that can lead to different outcomes in terms of the approach and the decision making and so on. I suppose being unfamiliar with the approach to take will also play a part in terms of what's possible. So thank you, Claire. It's really helpful. I noticed there's a few hands up. So I think, Andrew, I saw your hand up first, and then I'll go to Robin and then Kath, if that's okay.
Thank you. I think the difficulty is we tend to see the victims, and then what we're left with is anger and revulsion and dislike of the perpetrator. And if we see a perpetrator, then what is recalled is all our memories of the victims. So the same emotions run through us of unacceptability and, if anything, does not want to have anything to do with them, and kind of they're not nice people. So we're judge, jury, and executioner all in one.
Completely. I think it's really hard to unpack what builds into that, because there is a space where we don't want to let go of that dislike and that frustration, because it feels almost collusive. If I allow myself to build a rapport with this person, am I giving them permission to act in a certain way? And it's a question that most people who work with perpetrators in more full-time or targeted professional work have had to go through that journey of self-reflection and self-realization. And actually, my own experience of coming from a background of working with victims and victim services for a long time, I still remember I had a professor who was back in Canada, was developing a program for, they didn't use the term perpetrator. There was something really horrible, like wife beater program. This was back in the day. And I remember having the thought at the time of, how could you work with these people? That's absolutely not something I would ever even entertain. And then you fast forward less than a decade, and this work was introduced in such a way that I've had to challenge some of the belief systems that I had around it, because ultimately while I might feel a certain way about this person, in order to work effectively, it's not actually about me. And I think that's something that you build into your work in the same way that you would with a lot of other client group, is that awareness around what's the bias that's leading into, what's the belief system I've got that's leading into this conversation. But I think you're absolutely right, is first step is to identify that in the first instance, and the understand that it comes from a place of wanting to keep people safe and caring about what happens in terms of domestic abuse and the impacts. Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Robin.
The 2 points I wanted to quickly make crossover between beliefs and bias. What's already been said, I think due to most people's moral belief system, that we go into a situation like this with a clear kind of binary vision of right and wrong and who's good and who's evil and this and that and the other. And I think that creates a big barrier to want to discover why a perpetrator has acted the way they do, and what has their background been, and kind of going into the idea that actually most perpetrators have been victims themselves in other instances. And yeah, I think trying to move away from just what's right and wrong and trying to understand why this awful situation has occurred, and that what is an awful and at times an unforgivable behavior is a reflection on the behavior itself and not necessarily the person as a whole. And then the other point on bias is kind of being quick to assume who the perpetrator and victim is in a given situation. That you could easily make a mistake where you would see two people in a home and think, well, this person is more likely to be a victim, which often goes against men, that people would naturally assume that men are more likely to be a perpetrator than a victim. But isn't always the case.
Absolutely. I think you're right that not only do our moral guidance, I guess, influence the approach that we take and how that sort of influences the opportunities we have to have those conversations, but we have all kinds of bias, based on gender, based on race, based on age. And in order to combat that, we have to be constantly asking ourselves questions, which when we're asking questions, that can be a really uncomfortable place, because if we're asking ourselves questions of, did I make a correct assumption here? Or should I be questioning the assumption that I made? Or did I make an assumption here? Then we're on a bit of shakier ground, aren't we? Because we're not coming from a place of complete confidence in an approach. And so it's getting comfortable with the unknown, getting comfortable with that feeling of discomfort of having to explore, and using the opportunity to ask questions, to dig a little bit deeper. I know in the past I've done a lot of work as a practitioner for longer term perpetrator programs, and the number of times we had referrals for both people in a relationship from professionals that are asking us to try and unpack what's going on in the relationship, who is it that needs that support. And actually it's being able to have those conversations to identify maybe some of the problematic belief systems that feed into it. It's not necessarily about catching somebody out. It's about opening up a conversation to introduce the idea of, self-awareness and reflection.
Well, it's like every assumption that we make and put into that situation is a barrier from being able to get the full picture. The more that you're populating the situation with what your preconceptions and judgments are, the less opportunity you have for the perpetrator to actually give you an accurate impression of their version of events.
Absolutely. And I guess, you think about past experiences. I think we've all, actually, I can't speak for anybody else, so I'm not going to try, but I would guess that there are at least some people here or maybe watching who've had past experiences with people where it's left them a little bit shaken or unnerved. And that can absolutely influence how we feel about going into situations where we don't know how someone is going to respond. So we're cautious around it. It's part of human nature to be self-protective, but it's also important, if we want to start these conversations, to unpack where does that come from and what can I do to feel a bit more confident to start these conversations. So absolutely, there's a lot of food for thought around it, and these won't look the same for everybody, because everybody's got different experiences and pathways, and has had different opportunities for learning and reflection as well. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Robin. Hiya, Sandra.
Hi. I do agree with what Robin was saying about seeing the person as a whole. In my job as a health visitor, like Claire is, we have difficulty in seeing them separately. You know, when we go in, the couple are there together, and we have to act protectively in case there is a domestic abuse victim in the house. So trying to even open up a conversation about domestic abuse is not allowed, you know, really, from safety point of view. So really, it's the lack of opportunity if we suspect it's going on. If the victim has disclosed, how do we approach the perpetrator? So in our job, it's very little opportunity. And the other thing is also the the perpetrator accepting that there is a problem. You know, you're dealing with denial, and this is carrying on. They don't see it, or they see it as a cultural, well, this is how we are, you know, this is in our culture, like, don't interfere, you know, women have their place, etc., whatever. There's all those kind of things, you know, you're dealing with.
Absolutely. I think what you've done, Sandra, is very eloquently and succinctly, what you've highlighted is not only what we're trying to sort of unpack here and what prevents us from seeing the full picture, is you've identified that there are almost unique barriers to how you would go about doing your work, in terms of when you meet clients, how much time you have, do you see them alone? And what we look at in terms of that routine inquiry is asking individuals and teams to go away and explore within their existing processes, what are those opportunities to shift how we approach things? Maybe it's building a routine opportunity, and this is literally just me casting an idea out there. So this is not a suggestion, because I wouldn't want to put a strong suggestion forward without, it's more of an ongoing conversation. You'll know your team best and your managers and the structure of it all. But is there an opportunity to say, well, actually, we always, when we visit, have one-to-one with each of you separately, and that's part of the process, right? And so then it's not about, I need to talk to you separately. Maybe it's about, right, so we're just going to have our quick 5 minutes here and there and so on. And to be able to sort of shift slightly the approach in order to embed routine inquiry into that gives an opportunity not only for victims, but also for perpetrators to have that initial engagement. But it's about understanding what those barriers are first, and you've already pointed something really valid out, which is about, you know, well, this is how we see people currently. And then your second point about that person not being able to see their behavior, absolutely, we anticipate that in a lot of cases. There's something about self-awareness around the behavior, there's something about understanding choices, and there's also something about how much are they going to share that with the professionals that are around them as well. And my next slide actually is all about unpacking what the perpetrator barriers are. And that's a really key part of it, is because we could say everybody, the reason why they don't talk about it is because of X, Y, and Z, but actually it's understanding the context of that person and then looking at where are the opportunities to start that conversation. If we anticipate that minimization, that denial, and that blaming sort of attitude and mentality, then we work within it. Whereas it can be really frustrating if we want to have a conversation about, well, do you think your behavior is a problem? And we get a no. We've got nowhere to go with it, do we? So it's, how do we start that conversation? How do we build rapport? How do we explore further? Are they denying a lot of it, but there's a little bit that they are accepting? That gives us an opportunity to unpack a little bit further. That gives us an insight that they are able to see certain things. What are the things that they're not willing to see, and why? So there's opportunities to explore, but it's understanding how to carve those out, how to uncover them, as it were. And that's part of what we do is within DARE, is looking at understanding where those opportunities are and what we can do with them, how we can integrate that into our conversation. Even over a short period of time, we can make a lot of progress. Thank you, Sandra. That's really valuable. Kath, hello.
Hiya. I guess it was a bit on a practical level, really. Sounds very dull, but I guess as I'm sure the majority of us are clinicians who are working, they've been referred for whatever reason, whatever our service is, we're usually working with them. And I say that with the victim, and that
Mhm.
means we've got access to their records. So we are recording, we are accountable, we have, you know, we are able to work with them. Whereas if you've got somebody outside of that relationship and you haven't actually been referred them, it's a very dull practical issue, but it's a real one for health workers. So you can't really start engaging with someone else and looking at therapy models. And I think the other thing I was thinking is very often perpetrators of any kind of abuse often refer to having anger management issues. And I think we know as health providers that anger management is actually one of the worst things you can do to intervene. So if they're coming to us with, I have anger management, it needs a really broad, clear understanding of perpetrator issues, what the right interventions are. I think it'd be really dangerous to suggest we just went out and started engaging and having these conversations. So that was my feeling, my initial one. It's not of negativity, it's just of real safe logistics, really.
Absolutely. I mean, we need to be able to voice our sort of caution, our concern, our apprehension, because that's a part of what we're talking about here is what is preventing us from it. And actually, I think you're absolutely right, is looking at a therapeutic model is a big ask, isn't it? Because it's not a suggestion that all professionals out there then go off and replace perpetrator services, because there is a specialist focus need process for risk management and recording and everything else alongside that. This is about even earlier. This is about somebody in the waiting room, say hello. This is about maybe somebody accompanying someone to an appointment. This is about looking for those opportunities. And while of course I can't, I can make flippant suggestions like I've done with Sandra, it will be about an ongoing conversation to explore further what those opportunities look like within your workplace. And it's not to suggest that you would build a rapport over a course of weeks or months necessarily, unless there is opportunity to do that, which is great. But realistically, we're looking at starting that conversation. That's all that is. Even if it is, you know, a couple of minutes in passing, it's how do we do that in a way that doesn't dismiss that behavior, keep it hidden, and open up the space for having that conversation. And that will be very unique to your workplace, which is part of what will be explored in the training. Without being able to go into a lot of detail around this, it really is about making the idea of a routine inquiry for domestic abuse perpetrators or people who may be perpetrators fit within the context of your workplace, building that confidence, that understanding of a safe and effective approach. I think we do anticipate that there will be, and I'll move on in a second into looking at what those perpetrator barriers are. And anger management is one of those things that if we're actually making suggestions around anger management, then yes, it's not targeting appropriately to address the power dynamics that exist within domestic abuse. But it's also looking at successful engagement with perpetrators, understanding their own barriers. If there's shame and stigma associated with being a perpetrator, which we can say the rightly or wrongly how we feel about that shame and stigma around it, actually the end result we want is for somebody to engage in a process of reflecting and changing and being held accountable. And if we're reinforcing that shame and stigma by saying, no, you can't do anger management, you need to do a perpetrator program, instead of being curious, professional curiosity. What makes you say you think you need anger management? Can you tell me about that? I'm really interested. Talk to me more about, where did you hear that? Was there a situation that happened? So it's looking at the opportunity to open up that conversation around them talking about what might lead to more understanding around risk, for example, creating a space where that person, it's the first time maybe that they've been able to speak to a professional without feeling judged about reflecting on their behavior in an incident, which can then pave the way for them to engage more successfully with specialist services. It might open up a conversation to explore. There are different services that help people who have issues with anger in their relationships, and then you can carve that pathway in without necessarily reinforcing certain messages. But again, these are just ideas we're throwing out there that is all about exploring it even further as part of that conversation within the DARE modules. So there's no way that I can replace 3 half days within an hour's chat, but I think it's a really valuable piece of the puzzle there, is to unpack, what are my reservations? Where will this work? Where will it not? How can I explore that further? What are the conversations I can have? And so it's really valuable for you to bring that in. Thank you, Kath. We've talked a little bit about building an understanding of our own bias or barriers. And I think feeding into that is also unconscious bias. So what assumptions do we make about the people we work with or the situations without even being aware of it, because of our experiences or how we've been socialized or what's happened in the past? And so similarly, there's a lot of barriers that exist for the people who are causing harm, so the perpetrators themselves. And it can be really valuable to anticipate what some of these barriers to engagement look like. The DARE toolkit, not only is there the 3 half days of training, but there's also bound toolkit. You get a hard copy when you complete, and what it has is unpacking a lot of the topics and issues that we've discussed in the training, but also gives you tools to take away, skills to practice with frontline service users or clients, suggestions on what questions to ask or what might be a flag that gets raised for you. So you've got an opportunity to take that learning away so you can really focus on actually what's happening in the session. But if we think about what those perpetrator barriers look like, we can see right off the bat, I am sure that you're recognizing some of these, shame, minimization, denial, fear, blame, all of those things can be really key in terms of preventing somebody from joining a conversation. So similarly to working with any service users, if we can anticipate what those barriers are and we can work in, yes, a person-centered way, we can enhance that engagement. So if you think about the language we use, for example, the term perpetrator itself, sometimes it feels like if we secede from using that, we prevent ourselves from using the term perpetrator, we might feel like actually we're not allowing victim experience of being on the receiving end of abuse. But if that prevents somebody from engaging in a conversation, is it effective in preventing that behavior or encouraging that person to reflect on their behavior? And I think that that's the journey that I personally have been through, and having this conversation with a number of professionals over the last 8 years I've been working with the Hampton Trust and delivering training, is there is a journey that we go on to try and understand actually how is effective engagement with perpetrators going to lead to a prevention of further abusive behavior in the long term. And sometimes it's just having a conversation where somebody doesn't feel judged, where we're encouraging them to judge themselves, but we remain neutral ourselves as professionals, because it's about creating that space for reflection, for exploring, for building an understanding. And that's really important to take long term in terms of specialist perpetrator services. But so with that 1% of perpetrators that are offered a support, it makes it very difficult to get the rest of the people who are using this behavior into a place where they're actually offered something, where they're able to explore that further. So that's why we need everybody involved to try and look at what are the opportunities that I can bring somebody in? How can I work with those barriers? So we can ask ourselves, why do perpetrators minimize? Why do they blame other people or situations? Why are they so lacking in self-awareness of their own behavior? There were certain things that were brought into the conversation earlier around, is there a history of trauma there? Does that excuse the behavior? Absolutely not. But in our experience, what we've seen is that individuals who use abusive behavior, they will avoid looking at themselves. They will avoid reflecting on their own behavior. And that is a pattern that needs shifting. And in order to do that, people need to feel safe enough in a space to reflect, because it's really hard, even when we're not talking about domestic abuse, to sit and reflect on our own issues, on our own problems, on our own shame. And so creating a space to look at that safely is an opportunity for shifting, for changing. And so that's where we're seeing the conversation is unpacking and anticipating some of these barriers and looking at how we can use our understanding of these barriers to our advantage to target certain questions and conversations and be professionally curious. Andrew, I know you had your hand up before. You've taken it down now. I just wanted to check if you had anything else you wanted to add in here.
Yeah, I was interested. There was a situation the other day in clinic, female doctor, been qualified for 4 years, with a male patient, and the male patient, she came to the end of the consultation and said, you know, do you have any more questions? And he said, yeah, can I have your phone number?
Oh, okay.
And she said, no, I don't feel that's appropriate. And he said, well, I'm not leaving without it.
Mm.
And she relayed this to me, and I thought that is very, very clear perpetrator behavior, in that basically he is a man who doesn't listen. And so you can imagine him in a situation of somebody saying no to sex and him just continuing regardless. But I thought, in that situation, what would you advise her to do and say?
Well, that's a horribly uncomfortable situation for her to be in, and it sounds as though she might not be comfortable to explore that further with him, which is understandable. It may be that there's an opportunity to ask other professionals within her arena to have a conversation with somebody about what might be problematic. It's
I'm just in the middle of things.
it's an indication of entitlement, isn't it?
Yes.
And a belief system that is problematic.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly opportunities to explore. And without going into a lot of detail, maybe in this forum, I think it's really valuable to highlight the fact that there is a lot of behavior out there that is not being challenged, is not being explored, and therefore it may create an environment where this person leaves going, well, I'll try again next time, or I have that belief, and it's going to continue to grow, isn't it?
It's very interesting because the triggers that you can pull now are all sticks. So he will be approached, you know, I can imagine what will happen. It's gone up through the system and he's going to get a letter saying the way you spoke to this person is not acceptable. It's very, but there's not much that's helpful, you know, to him, saying, hey, you know, what you said to her upset her. Can you think why it might have upset her? You know, and so I think it's long overdue, all this whole strategy and avenue, because pushing it underground just it entrenches behavior. So if you challenge him and go, you're a naughty boy, we're not going to see you in clinic, you're not going to get to see another female, you're this, that, and you're that, then he just goes, well, you've made sides of offence with him clearly in the wrong, and he obviously doesn't feel he is in the wrong. So so what's available at the moment? Hampton Trust?
I mean, absolutely. Referral to specialist services.
So could I have said to him, you know, dispassionately, you have a fundamental thing that's going to run you into trouble. Would you like a referral to somebody who can explore that with you?
That sounds like a really helpful end of a conversation.
Yeah.
So without, again, being able to go into all kinds of detail on it at this point in this forum, but if you want to hang back afterwards, I'm happy to unpack it a little bit with you. What I would say is that direct, confrontational but helpful suggestion to me sounds like the end of a conversation. So how do you start that in? Because you're more likely to get buy-in if you can build on based on where somebody else is at. So he's not going to be in a place where he sees that. So you would want to start it by What made you ask that? Let's start with that. Did you
Hmm.
notice anything about how she felt about it, or is that something you do regularly? And like use the questions to get them to talk more, because the more they talk, the more you understand about their context, where they're at, how they might respond to questions, things like that. So you build that into the approach. But let's pick this up after, if that's all right.
Lovely.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Claire, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, it's only just a really quick one, just to add on to what Andrew's saying, really. But in our role as health visitors, we have to be mindful because we're lone workers and we're going into people's homes, often on our own. So having that sort of conversation and thinking about risk to you, but yeah, as you said, like thinking about, I don't know, maybe whether you could see them in a clinic setting at 6 weeks, but it's all those sorts of things. Just wanted to add, really.
Absolutely. I think the strength and the value of taking a professionally curious and motivational approach to conversations is it's not about being confrontational. It's about exploring the opportunities and getting them to start having that conversation. Not to say that you're not in the back of your mind considering risk and reading the situation and working with, okay, that's as much as I can explore today, and I might pick this up, or I might make a suggestion for a colleague, or things like that. That it's about enhancing our approach to addressing domestic abuse as a whole, because we all have the same goal in mind, is we want to prevent further harm. And it might bleed into behavior that isn't necessarily domestic abuse related. It could be problematic behavior in the workplace, or it could be, in a public setting. And you just think about, actually, it's bringing the conversation into a more public arena where we're not holding all of this sort of specialist learning, that it's actually something that we can all take part in, but we want to encourage people to feel comfortable and confident to do it and to approach it safely. And that's really key, is we need to start from the foundation up. And that just comes from, let's rip off the Band-Aid and start to see where those opportunities are in our own professional environments, and then going from there. I know years ago, I don't know if I've come across anybody in this arena before, but I was working in a team that was responsible for encouraging health professionals to basically to routinely inquire with victims. And one of the things I remember us saying regularly was that we need to be able to ensure that victims are asked at any opportunity, because the wrong situation, the wrong response can really discourage that engagement. And unfortunately, the same is true of perpetrators. If somebody is talking about abusive behavior in a way of, you're a horrible person and you'll never change, then the reality is that they're going to go away and thinking that all professionals are going to think about them like that, which is may or may not be true, but what it's going to do is discourage that engagement. And we need to start that conversation in order to build in that change, because we're never going to prevent it if we don't work with the root of the problem. I'm really aware of time now. We've got 4 minutes left on our webinar. So just to highlight really briefly that there's, I think what we've touched on really is looking at all of these different barriers, but looking for the opportunities within that. So what difference you can make is to bring this conversation into your place of work, integrated into the way that you engage with clients, whatever that looks like. And that's part of what's explored within DARE. So recently, an independent evaluation by Southampton University for individuals or delegates who had completed DARE. And what we saw off the back of that was that there was an 81% increase reported from delegates who completed DARE, feeling that they were confident in starting conversations with perpetrators, and a 70% reported better understanding of how to refer and signpost clients to specialist services for perpetrators. So we're having those conversations and we're referring in people who might not have ever heard about, been told about, been encouraged or motivated in to engage with that specialist support. And that's what we want to see, is that it becomes, I know that this is a tagline that's used for engaging with victims, but it's very much of the same ilk, that it's everybody's business. So let's start that conversation. We've had some really positive feedback from somebody who works, I don't think it was a health visitor team, but they were in frontline early childhood working, and they completed the training. So I'm just going to play this.
I'm here to help the victim, but actually it's made me think she doesn't want to leave him. She wants to stay with him, and she wants her children to stay with him.
Hi, Liz.
So well, I need to build up that rapport and understand him and where he's coming from. And I think it's the DARE training really helped me, gave me that insight into why I need to build that relationship as well.
They want you to add some bits. I just thought if you could do that, then I've got to send it out to everybody's approval.
Sorry, Andrew, do you mind if I ask you to mute again?
Say again.
Do you mind just muting yourself? Sorry, thank you. Brilliant. Okay, and then just to highlight as well that as part of the DARE offer or the plan is looking at identifying and training up people locally who can carry and embed these principles forward. So it's not just about come on some training and reflect and think about how these changes can be implemented, but actually let's bring this conversation to local strategies for domestic abuse. How can we encourage this policy change? How can we create and shape the space to have these one-to-one conversations? Can we update our referral or intake questionnaire to incorporate certain conversations? Can we include the idea of DARE or routine inquiry for perpetrators into induction for new staff within teams? You know, how is it that we can start to embed it further? And it's by developing a bit of a train the trainer, or we call it a DARE champion, but really it's just about bringing that knowledge more integrated and a bit more embedded into local services. So there is more information if you're interested to know more about this model to enhance the DARE training offer, but it's just to highlight that that is available. So thank you so much for bearing with me through what was a really valuable and interesting discussion that you can see how we get such interesting and rich conversations throughout the training that I'm always really valuable to hear about people's experiences of what's worked, what's not worked, what their questions are to bring the training to life, because it is about working with who we've got in the room. So with that in mind, I just wanted to add that if you want to know more, if you're interested, we've got a dedicated website. I mean, it actually just redirects you to the Hampton Trust website, but it's just easier to remember this way, daretoolkit.org.uk, or you can reach out to our training admin who can send you more information. If you're in Gloucester, there is a specific Gloucestershire DARE cohorts that are set up, so you can book on for free. So just reach out, or there should be more information circulated. I think there's quite a few people who've already booked on from January. So it would be great to have everybody on board. Please tell your friends and colleagues about it as well. And just reach out if you have any questions. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all, and thank you so much for your time.